Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be taking a look at Voltron Legendary Defender. And we're not just casually rewatching this. I've actually got the entire series audio commentary. So we're really going to dive deep into this and really see how this show evolved over time, what worked, what went wrong, and of course all that legendary fandom drama.
It really is a fascinating show to look back on in terms of like adaptation, and the choices creators make under pressure. And we can't forget about the unpredictable world of fan expectations.
Exactly right.
Oh.
If you've ever wondered how a show with so much promise ends up in, sparking such heated debates, well, this deep dive is for you. We'll be looking at animation character arcs, some of those jaw-dropping plot twists, and yeah, we're even going to venture into the sometimes murky waters of fandom.
Think of it this way, we're extracting the universal lessons here. How commercial demands can shape the creative process, how fans can interpret things in ways you wouldn't believe, and how even good intentions around representation can sometimes miss the mark.
Absolutely. So let's kick things off by talking about those early wins. Seasons 1 and 2. I mean, they hooked viewers for a reason, right? The animation was top-notch. Thanks to the studio behind Avatar, the characters were so memorable, each with their own compelling storylines. And that blend of Star Wars rebel energy with Star Trek's exploration, I mean, it was genius.
The early seasons were so good at world building, Especially when it came to showing those tactical battles against the Galar Empire. Remember in season 1 when they used the terrain to outsmart the enemy? That was the kind of tactical brilliance I'm talking about. It really made you root for those paladins as they faced impossible odds. And let's not forget the lions. They weren't just cool robots. They were sentient beings with their own personalities. It added a whole other layer to the action.
Totally. And that Black Paladin reveal in season 1, I mean, it answered a question nobody was even asking yet, but it was done so cleverly. It really hinted at the detailed world building the creators had planned.
Absolutely. It set a high standard, hinting at complex stories and character relationships that could unfold. But the big question is, did they manage to keep up that level of quality as the show went on?
That is the question. Now, season 3 felt like a turning point. It was a shorter season with more focus on Allura's struggles. And then we had the introduction of Loder, who quickly became a fan favorite.
Season 3 was almost like a bridge. It set the stage for future storylines, but it didn't have the same satisfying arc as the first two. However, there were some really interesting details, like Zarkon's backstory. Instead of just being pure evil, we saw his ambition and how it clashed with Alphar's ideology. It really added nuance to their relationship.
Yeah, it really makes you think, did it humanize Zarkon too much? Or was it crucial to understand his motivations? But things start to get a little rocky in seasons 4 through 6. We see some cracks starting to appear.
Yeah, the pacing definitely takes a hit. Probably because Netflix wanted more seasons, and this resulted in some rushed storylines and filler episodes, like Horan's PR campaign and that infamous D&D episode. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. I remember the filler episodes are one thing. But the pacing issues also affected the character arcs. Keith's Blade of Marmora storyline felt kind of repetitive. Pidge's search for her brother ended up feeling a bit emotionally manipulative. And then they introduced new characters, which kind of stretched that already large cast a little thin.
Yeah, it's like they were juggling too many plot threads, and it started to take away from the overall story. The narrative wasn't as cohesive.
Right. And even with these issues, there were still some pretty brilliant moments, like that epic fight between Luder and Zarkon. The animation was incredible, and the personal stakes between them just took the whole thing to another level. I mean, was that the peak of the show?
It was definitely a highlight, It really showed how powerful the storytelling could be when they focused on well-developed conflicts between characters. But sadly, the decline becomes more noticeable in seasons 7 and 8.
Yeah. It felt a bit aimless without a central villain after Loder. And the Paladins kept losing their powers over and over, which started to feel repetitive. And then there were those increasingly far-fetched plot devices like Shiro being cloned.
And the planet-destroying weapons escalating to universe-ending threats. It just felt like a departure from the more grounded, tactical approach of those earlier seasons. Remember those amazing strategic battles? This felt different.
Totally different. And then, of course, there's that whole Voltron fandom saga. The shipping wars, the promises about representation that weren't met, and a whole lot of misinformation flying around.
It's important to remember that fan communities are passionate and invested in the stories they love. And, when those expectations aren't met, disappointment can turn into frustration and even anger.
It became almost impossible to separate valid criticism from all the noise. Were the creators overpromising, or were fans just misinterpreting subtle hints?
It's a really interesting question, about creators and their audiences, especially in the age of social media. How much should creators cater to what fans want?
And how much freedom should fans have to, like, interpret and expand on a story without crossing a line? It's a delicate balance, and Voltron is a perfect example of how these dynamics can get complicated and sometimes even messy.
Absolutely. So let's unpack this whole Voltron fandom thing, shall we? It's like
Yeah.
a textbook example of how passionate fans can sometimes go a little overboard.
Overboard, might be
Yeah.
putting it mildly. I mean, think like intergalactic level shipping wars, leaked concept art being passed around, and fans even trying to hold that art hostage to make the creators, make their favorite pairings canon. It was wild.
Yeah, and it's interesting how misinformation just spread like wildfire, fueled by all that speculation and those unverified claims. It was like a game of telephone, where
Yeah.
the message gets totally distorted with each whisper. It created this huge disconnect between what the show is actually doing and what some fans believed they'd been promised, especially when it came to representation.
And those whispers had real-world consequences. I mean, the cast and crew faced online harassment, even death threats, which led some of the voice actors to avoid conventions entirely. There were petitions to remove the show from Netflix, mostly from people who felt let down by the representation. It went way beyond your typical fan disagreements.
Yeah, it really highlights this crucial point about fan expectations, right? Like representation is important, but some fans took it to extremes. They blurred the lines between interpretation and headcanon. Like headcanon is basically those fan-created narratives that fill in the gaps or take the story in directions that the creators never intended. It can get kind of tricky.
So can we really blame fans for wanting to see themselves reflected in the stories they love? Or did the show unintentionally encourage this by, like, hinting at things it never actually delivered on? It's a tough one.
It is. On the one hand, creators have the right to tell their stories without being dictated to by fans. But when a show attracts such a diverse fan base, those fans are naturally going to have hopes and desires for representation.
And the problem is, when those desires morph into demands and constructive criticism devolves into harassment and toxicity, the Voltron fandom became a cautionary tale of how things can go so wrong when those lines get blurred.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that not all fans were part of this toxic element. Plenty
Yeah.
of fans engaged thoughtfully and respectfully. They created art, wrote fan fiction, and discussed themes. Those positive communities existed, but they often got overshadowed by all the negativity.
And context is key.
Yeah.
Like, take that I Love You scene between Keith and Shiro.
Mm-hmm.
Taken out of context, it could definitely be seen as romantic, but within the scene itself, it's clearly a moment of platonic brotherly love.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The fandom was so eager for LGBTQ plus representation that they sometimes lashed onto moments that were open to interpretation, which is understandable, but it also led to a lot of disappointment and accusations of queer baiting when those interpretations weren't confirmed by the creators.
Right. And the showrunners did eventually admit that they mishandled the queer representation, especially with Adam. But by then, the damage was done. The fandom was so divided that even sincere apologies were met with skepticism and anger.
It's a lesson in how important clear communication is and careful consideration. When incorporating diverse representation, token gestures or vague hints can do more harm than good, especially with sensitive topics.
And then there's the issue of fans confusing actors with their characters. The voice actors were constantly bombarded with questions about plot points and character relationships that were totally outside of their control.
Right. That points to a bigger issue where fans feel increasingly entitled to influence the direction of their favorite stories. Social media has blurred the lines between audience and creator, which has led to unrealistic expectations and even a sense of ownership over a fictional world.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope. Ultimately, creators have the right to tell their stories as they see fit, even if it doesn't match every fan's vision.
Of course, that doesn't excuse bad writing or poor creative decisions, but it highlights the need for respectful dialogue and understanding how complex the creative process really is. A show like Voltron, with its massive global fan base, was bound to attract a wide range of opinions and interpretations.
And let's be honest, the show itself wasn't perfect.
Yeah.
The pacing issues, the inconsistent character development, and that heavy reliance on space magic in the later seasons, those choices definitely contributed to the fandom's frustration.
It's like a recipe where you keep adding ingredients without thinking about how they'll work together. You might end up with something edible, but it won't necessarily be delicious or satisfying.
Voltron had all the right ingredients. Compelling characters, dynamic animation, a rich world that was just ripe for exploration. But somewhere along the way, the recipe went wrong.
Maybe it was pressure from the network or the demanding production schedule, or maybe the creators just lost sight of their initial vision.
Or maybe it was the sheer weight of fan expectations, that constant demand for more that pushed the show off course.
It's such a fascinating and complex case study. full of lessons about storytelling, the creative process, and that delicate dance between creators and their audience.
So after all that, let's shift gears to the final season. Did Voltron stick the landing or did it crash and burn?
That, my friend, will determine if Voltron is remembered as a flawed but ambitious attempt to revive a classic, or as a cautionary tale about unchecked ambition and the fickle nature of fandom.
Okay, season 8, the final showdown. Everything's on the line.
Yeah.
The incredible highs, the disappointing lows, the fandom frenzy. Did Voltron manage to pull it all together for a satisfying conclusion?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And like most things with Voltron, the answer is, well, it's complicated. On the one hand, you've got Unnerva, right, the true antagonist revealed at last. And she's driven by this overwhelming grief to reshape reality itself. It's a pretty powerful concept when you think about it.
Oh, yeah. She's not messing around. We're talking universe-ending threats,
Yeah.
realities colliding power levels that make Zarkon look like a kid playing in a sandbox. The stakes were definitely high, but did it feel earned? You know? After all those seasons of, like, uneven pacing and power creep, it was hard to even keep track of what the rules were anymore.
Exactly. Like 1 minute, the paladins are struggling to power up their lions, and the next, they're merging with giant space whales and warping through dimensions. It got a bit much.
It did.
That reliance on space magic and those dedeminous ex machina solutions, you know? It felt like the writers were just throwing everything at the wall, hoping something would stick and recapture that magic from the early seasons.
And then there's Allura. Her arc in this final season is pretty pivotal. Her
Yeah.
powers are reaching these almost godlike levels. But that sudden romantic interest in Lance, it felt forced, like a last-ditch effort to give her a happy ending before, well, you know.
Yeah, it kind of highlighted a tendency in the show to prioritize those big plot twists and grand gestures over the kind of subtle character development that we saw in those earlier seasons.
Right.
Like, we're told that Allura and Lance have these deep feelings, but we don't really see those feelings develop naturally.
Yeah, it's like they skipped a few chapters of their relationship and the audience is left trying to fill in the blanks.
And then there's that final sacrifice. Allura merging with the energy of the universe to undo all the damage that Unnerva caused and restore reality. It's visually stunning, packed with symbolism and emotion.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it also felt kind of inevitable. You know, almost from the moment Allura's power started to emerge, you could sense that she was being set up for this tragic end.
Which makes you wonder, was her sacrifice really a choice? Or was it just the inevitable outcome of a past that was already laid out for her? A way for the writers to tie up those loose ends and provide that sense of closure.
And the aftermath, the Lions leaving Earth Voltron, disbanding,
Yeah.
it all felt very symbolic, almost like the show itself was saying goodbye.
It could be interpreted as a nod to the show's journey, you know? The constant struggle to balance that creative vision with network demands and those passionate fan expectations.
Or maybe it was a deliberate choice to prevent any future reboots or revivals.
Yeah.
A way of saying, this is it. This is the end. Let Voltron rest.
Regardless of the intention, it definitely leaves you with a bittersweet feeling, a sense of closure for sure, but also that lingering question, could it have been different?
Could Voltron have reached its full potential if things had been different? Or was it always destined to be this cautionary tale about overreaching ambition and the unpredictable nature of fandom? It's a question that really stays with you.
We've explored the highs and the lows, the triumphs and the missteps, the passionate fandom and the behind-the-scenes struggles. Voltron Legendary Defender was a show that dared to dream big, even if it didn't always stick the landing.
It's a powerful reminder that even in a universe of giant robots and epic space battles, it's those human stories, the connections between characters that really resonate with us.
And that sometimes even the most legendary defenders need to lay down their swords and find peace.
So what are your takeaways from this deep dive? What will you remember about Voltron Legendary Defender? Share your thoughts, keep those conversations going, and maybe, just maybe, the legend will live on Hodenaro.